Hello, everybody. My name is James Murua, and welcome to the James Murua Literary Podcast, a product of the James Murua Literary, and which is brought to you in partnership with the Frankfurter Buchmesse, with financial support from the German Federal Foreign Office. Thank you for joining us today. As you can guess, my name is James Murua, and I'm really excited today. We'll be chatting with two eminent personalities in the field we'll be chatting with. We'll start with a gentleman who's closest to me. His name is Dr. Günther Orth. He's an academic who taught Arabic language at the universities of Erlangen, Würzburg, Regensburg, Berlin, and Bochum. He's an interpreter and translator for translated works in books and magazines, and he's translated several works, including The Messiahs von Darfur, which is, the Messiah of Darfur by Abdelaziz Barak Sakin, and several other works. Thank you, Günther, for joining the live stream today. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me, James. Very glad to be your guest.
Thank you. Our other guest is Xavier Luffan. He's a professor of Arabic literature at the University of Brussels in Belgium. He's translated several short novels, short stories, poems, and dramas from Arabic into French. He's translated several people like Ahmad El-Malik and Amir Tagelsir, both Sudanese. And he's also translated Vamba Sharif's Bound to Secrecy. Thank you, Xavier, for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think I know both of you translate, from Arabic to German and from Arabic to French. But the one thing that's an interesting thread for both of you is that you've both translated Sudanese writers. And I just wanted to know, let's start with Sudan. Do you have any opinions on what's happening in Sudan with the coup right now? Maybe you start with you, Günther. Günther?
Well, yes, I was shocked when I heard the news a few days ago that military coup was going on there. And I was starting to get into contact with my friends in Sudan, make sure they're safe. It seems the internet connection is difficult to Sudan these days, but many of them expressed their optimism in spite of everything, because they made this revolution happen 2 years ago. It seemed to go so well, better than in other countries. Better than in Egypt. They learned many lessons there, and still, after these promising beginnings, the military took over. Let's hope for the best for Sudan. Let's hope for the best for the revolution and the success of the civilian revolution, in order to have a democratic Sudan in the future, as I saw it when I was there last time 2 years ago.
Xavier?
Yeah, it was, well, actually, it was a real disappointment. I mean, I was so happy for Sudan since a couple of years, when I saw that things were somehow evolving. That situation was, situation was not 100% perfect, of course, but to give you an example, there was a book fair in Khartoum during the last weeks, and as far as I understood, all of the books written by Abdelaziz, by instance, who were forbidden earlier, were now, openly sold at the fair. And so when I learned this news, I was so happy, not only for Abdelaziz, of course, but for Sudanese people, because finally they could, have kind of freedom of expression, including freedom of reading novels that tackle issues like dictatorship and poverty and civil war. And well, all of a sudden, they made a step forward again. So it's a pity. I'm very saddened, but I'm crossing my fingers. I hope it will. It's just a step, and things will getting better. But it's very. I mean, it happened just a couple of days ago, so it's very hard to have. I mean, firm news about what's going on over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
As Günther said, I mean, internet is not, and it's quite difficult to have. I have some news via the diaspora, but I didn't really get news directly from Sudan. Let's cross our fingers.
Okay.
But
I mean,
it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that Baraka Sakin, the author, has been in exile for some, I think, 8 or 9 years now from Sudan, and he was very reluctant to come back to Sudan because he was on the list, on the wanted list of the regime then, and he's still a hated figure by the military. So I think he was right not to go back to Sudan very quickly.
I just brought it up because I support the people of Sudan, and I'm in solidarity with them in the struggle against the military. No one wants military rule in any society. So let's start with our discussion now. Xavier, why did you get into this Arabic literature, right? Arabic space?
Well, for me, it was somehow it was. I would say it was by chance. I first studied archaeology when I was at university, and there was also a department of Oriental languages. And actually, I was more interested in Turkish than in Arabic. But if you wanted to learn Turkish at that time, Arabic was compulsory. So I said, well, why not? I will learn Arabic beside Turkish. But it was not my main goal. And well, at the end of the day, it became somehow, it's what I teach at university, and the books, most of the books I translate are written in Arabic. But I would say it was by chance, if something like chance does really exist.
And you got
but then it became
more or less the same, James. In fact, because I was interested in non-European cultures and non-European languages, and the city I was in then, Erlangen, had more or less two choices. You could study Chinese or Arabic, and I wasn't sure. I took the wrong door, and I landed in with Arabic. It was an experiment first, because I mean, with languages, you can't be sure. This is an adventure. This is a long way to go, always with the new language. You just test the ground in the beginning, but I found myself to be, well, not the worst of the students. And then I said to myself, well, so let's go on. I had an offer for a scholarship to Egypt, first, then to Syria, and I was very happy to go there. The African countries, Arabic-speaking African countries, came lately, like Sudan. Of course, you have North Africa, you have the Maghreb states from Morocco to Egypt. This is Africa, but they are part of what they call the Arab world, and in a narrow sense. And Sudan is always between the Arab world and the African world, and that was very thrilling to me, to see that there's another country which is quite different. It's bordering to Egypt, but it's so different from Egypt in many ways. And like Sudanese say sometimes, we speak Arabic, but we don't think in Arabic. If we are an African country, we have African culture, and just by chance we have the Arabic language. And even some Sudanese would say, yes, because this is because the Arabs used to colonize us. So we took their language, but not all of their culture. It's still different. Sudan is different.
That is so interesting. I'll go back to you, Xavier, because there's something I just want to have an idea, because a lot of the people who would be watching this broadcast either know now or later, they may not know much about what kind of things are being written about in Arabic, because sometimes you'd imagine there's a huge religious component to the writing. That's what you'd imagine. So what are some of the things you'd find when you're exploring texts that are written in Arabic?
Yeah. Who are you addressing, James? Sorry.
I'm saying the people who would be watching this or who would be watching this broadcast really don't know much about the space of writing in Arabic. They may be coming from African Anglophone speaking Africa, and they may not know much about it. So what are some of the things that people are writing in Arabic, whether it's Northern Africa or even the Maghreb region?
Mm-hmm. Well, an interesting point, I think, is that, Arabic is, of course, used all over the Middle East. I mean, I would say the Near East and the Arabian Peninsula, and but also the whole North Africa, from Morocco to Egypt, and so I would say that, well, Arabic is used in more than 20 different countries as an official languages, the spread of Arabic as a means of as a literary language is evolving. I mean, it's a work in progress, and you have since some decades more and more African countries where Arabic is used as a literary language. Of course, I mean, in some countries like Mali or Senegal or Nigeria, Arabic is used was used for centuries, but more for religious purpose, you know.
Okay, yes.
Countries, even sometimes unexpected countries, I would say, like Somalia and Eritrea in East Africa, or even countries like Nigeria or even Senegal, where you have now new authors, young authors, who write fiction, short stories, poetry in Arabic. So I would say that Arabic is really, I would say, of course, first it's an African language for me. I mean, geographically speaking, but culturally speaking, it became somehow like, I would say, like English or Portuguese or French or Swahili. You know, those main languages which are used in the field of fiction and literature. And that's quite unknown. I mean, most of the people they relate Arabic with mainly with the Near East and with North Africa. And yes, of course, it remains the two centers of the Arabic literature. But still, even beside those two centers, you have more and more countries where Arabic, becomes an important component of literature.
What about you, Günther? I mean, he's been talking about the Africa and the Middle East. What about you in Europe? What are people using Arabic for in that part of the world?
First, I would like to support what Xavier said. I also was for some time seeing that there are emerging new young authors from African countries writing in Arabic newly, like Eritrea, as you said. Haji Jaber is one case. And Haji Jaber, as far as I know, was born or was raised in Saudi Arabia for migration reasons with his parents and learned Arabic there. But still, Arabic is also used in some small parts of Eritrea, or the coastline to the Red Sea. So he made his case with Arabic language, writing novels in Arabic language, very nice novels, and which are finding their readers. I think certainly not, mainly not inside Eritrea, because Eritrea has become something like the African North Korea. And it's critical of the regime. It's critical of the military. It's critical of the army, and it's well, in the light of what we see now between Ethiopia and Eritrea, I think it's understood. It's very understandable what he writes there, and he writes about Eritreans taking refuge to Sudan once more. But yes, you have Eritrea, Sudan, Niger, maybe Mali, and new writers writing in Arabic, which is a very interesting trend, I think, because you have the opposition going on in some North African countries like Algeria, even Morocco and Tunisia, where writers tend to write in French instead of Arabic. And they're quite successful in that. And they're more successful in Europe, this is your question, James, than many of their colleagues writing in Arabic, because in France, they can read what they write directly. And they may sell their books in France or in the French-speaking book markets quite much better than the colleagues writing in Arabic, whose works have to be translated into European languages first. And this is one of the big obstacles to speak about in the first place. And this is one of the big obstacles for Arabic literature in Europe, if you like.
I have a question which is really perturbing for me, because I have been following Arabic literature in the Arab countries of the Northern Africa, and I always got the impression that it's it has a really vibrant space. They have huge book fairs. They have many publishing houses. They have several. It seems like a vibrant space. So why would wouldn't somebody writing in Arabic just be able to survive within that space?
Good question, Xavier. Do you want to answer, or do you let me?
I'm sorry. The sound wasn't that, but the connection wasn't that better. Can you just repeat, James? I'm so sorry. In few words, what was your question?
My question was that, from my observation as an outsider, the literary and publishing space of Northern Africa and Middle East seems to be very vibrant. There are many book fairs, there are many literature, there are many publishers. So why would it be like a hindrance for somebody? Would they be able to survive within that space?
I would also like to answer. Please go ahead.
Talking about North Africa. Talking about North Africa, what's happening there is quite interesting, because yes, they have a lot of book fairs, they have their own publishers, but it seems for countries like Morocco and Algeria, and even Tunisia, somehow you have two different cultural spheres. You have you have writers who keep on writing in French, and then you have those writers who write in Arabic. But I noticed, once or twice I was at the book fair in Casablanca in Morocco, and you see that quite often there are no connections between those two worlds. French-speaking authors are on one side, and Arabic-speaking or I would say writers who use Arabic are on. And purposely neglect each other. It's an interesting thing that does not really happen in the Middle East, for instance. Then you have another trend which is not that well known, which is the development of a fiction in Berber, especially in Kabyle language, especially in Algeria. You know, the local market for those books.
Yeah.
But yes, you have some very interesting Moroccan and Algerian writers who use Arabic, and but unfortunately, if you take a country like, especially France, of course, and Belgium, people tend to know more about Moroccan literature or Algerian literature written in French than this literature written in Arabic, because there is a lack of translation, you know. If you try to, not always of course, but if you try to convince a publisher to translate a book from a Moroccan or an Algerian author into French, they will tell you, well, you know, we have so many, we know already so many Moroccan or Algerian authors, we already know them. Then you tell them, yes, okay, but they write in French. Here it's an author who writes in Arabic, it's something else. But, well, the publishers do not always see the difference between those two. I would call it two worlds, even if there are connections between them, of course.
Not only this, Xavier, it's also more costly for the publisher to have the book translated, to have the book read by somebody, to have the book rated by some expert or by the translator, and then taking the risk of publishing this book, only having read maybe 5 or 10 pages of the translated version, and he can't be sure if this will sell well in France or in Belgium or in Europe. Same to the German book market, of course. And I mean, I was spending 5 or 6 years in order to get Baraka Sakin's book published in German. I was convinced that this is an important book. I liked the story. I thought it was important to read for German readers. It took 1 or 2 or several international prizes as one of the best African novels of the year 2000 and something. And nobody wanted to see it in German. And finally, Stefan Trudewen from Edition Orient came up and said, yes, I want to take this. I want to have this book. I will publish this book and maybe even more books in the future by Baraka Sakin. But back to your question, James. I'm not sure if the Arabic book market is really so vibrant. You know, Arabic writers are struggling to live from their writing. Very, very few of them really can live of their writing. And if they do, they have their books translated into some other languages. They can't live, I would say. No Arabic author can live just by his Arabic books, by his books sold in Arabic countries. You have additional problems like book distribution, which is normally not very good. You have unlicensed copies going around. You have internet copies, PDF, because people are not ready to spend their money on books. I mean, it's not their fault, because you have all this economic and political turmoil in most of the Arabic states. People are struggling to buy their daily bread. So, do they have money left for books? Do they have much money left for books? They don't. It's different, of course, in the Gulf region, in Saudi Arabia, and so on. But in most Arab countries, no, you can't make a living out of writing. And this is why many young authors, even the beginners, think about having their works translated even in a very early stage. even before anybody knows them in their own country, and this is right. This is really strange sometimes.
It's
This
really
is
weird.
very odd. I sometimes, I mean, I'm getting emails, I'm getting letters, I'm getting WhatsApp letters every week by young authors. Same with you, Xavier, by young authors of
Yes,
every
the same with me.
of every sex and of every Arab country, asking me to translate their works into German, as sometimes as a first step
Yeah.
or something, which is really a word, because I think the natural thing should be you should be an author who writes for his own people in his own country, is successful there, is well known there, and then in a certain stage afterwards, somebody should come and say, I want your works to be translated into my language, but not, but it has become the other way around.
Yes, I see what you mean. It applies to many other parts. I mean, so Xavier, I mean, I want to know, and I asked it earlier. So, I mean, what are the stories that people are writing? I mean, are they writing your typical normal stories of, literary fiction, or are there any interesting new forms like speculative, or it's the same stuff you see, literary fiction?
Yeah. It, it's very hard to answer this question, because even if you take Sudan alone, I mean, the literary scene is so large that you have a spectrum of genres and themes, and so it's you will find a lot of. I mean, what I would say is that the African writers who write in Arabic, they bring something very new. They really enrich the Arabic literature, because they enrich it in at least three ways. I would say that the first way is that they bring some new themes in literature, like especially in Sudan, the question of identity is very important. This kind of as you
Line has become bad.
I mean,
Yeah.
or speak in Arabic, but they think language. You can hear me?
No,
You hear me? Are you
maybe
hearing me?
I'm not. You're not really clear. No, you're not clear at all. So, what
I'm
I'll
not
do
clear.
is there. No, you're
Sorry.
not clear. Günther, would you please attempt that question?
Sorry.
Question of new topics coming into the Arabic literature by Sudanese authors and African authors, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. As Xavier said, I have the same observations. The question of identity, question of the history of the country, slavery that was going on, the question of language and religion. Yes, there's always new topics coming up, but it's not only, this is not only true for Sudan or for certain African countries, because even inside the classical Arabic countries, if you like, it's always new topics coming up. It's so many new young authors. I mean, there's a population growth, and there's always more young readers and always more young Arabic writers. So it is not like Arabic literature in Egypt, they are writing on this. In Syria, they would write about the war. And in Palestine, they would write about loss of their country and so on. It's not like this anymore. It's has become a space for individuality, a space for big creativity, And it's very hard to keep on reading all these new works. It's very hard. It's so many new authors, even in countries like Saudi Arabia, where 20 or 30 years ago, there was more or less, there was no literature, there was no fiction being written there. And now you have so many. You can name 10 or 20 names of quite important Saudi authors, men and women. I think this is important. But yeah.
Yeah, maybe we let Xavier try and attempt this one now.
Is it better now? Is it better now? You
yes,
can
much
hear
better. Yes, much better.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. What I wanted to say is that if we focus just on, I would say, Arabic literature in Africa, especially in a country like Sudan, but that's the same for Eritrea or Somalia, for instance. You know, they tackle some, I would say they tackle some all the issues
He's frozen again.
That were already present in racism, dictatorship, migration, but they bring a new dimension, you know, because they talk about the African experience of all those issues.
Yes, you said
that was. You
said there are three things. No, I can hear you now. You're in and out, but I can hear you now. You said there are three things. One of them is identity.
That's the first thing. Yeah. So one thing is the new themes like identity, for instance, you know, especially African identity in Arabic literature. The second point is new ways to tackle all the issues. As I said, migration, civil war, colonialism, all those issues, you will find them in books written elsewhere in Arabic. But the authors bring some a kind of new dimension. You know, for instance, we were mentioning Haji Jaber. He talks about migration, but he talks about migration from an African country, Eritrea, to Sudan, and then also, you know, the Saudi Arabia and things like this. And so those are issues that are well known in the Arab world, but there is a new dimension, which is this African dimension. And then a third innovation, I would say, is that some author will develop. If you take, for instance, magical realism. Magical realism is very rich in Sudan, you know, but it is rooted into the African experience of the country. So we know very well. Magical realism in South America, for instance, but in Nigeria as well. You find it in Sudan as well, but expressed in a new language, which is Arabic. And all those experiences are brought by Sudanese authors. Was it
Magical
clear?
realism. Yes, it's clear. Magical realism. I mean, do you mind, because you clearly know quite a bit about Sudanese literature. Apart from Abdelaziz, what are some of the people I want to be checking out or reading if I want to experience this literature?
Well, I think that the first name that comes to anybody's mind is Tayyib Saleh. He's the author of Season of Migration to the North, which was not the first Sudanese novel. There were some earlier novels, but it was the first one that really gained some success, that became successful first in the Arab world and then in the Anglophone world. You know, the book was translated just 2 years after it was published in Arabic, which is quite surprising for a country where nobody was translated earlier. So the book was written in the 60s, and it tackles the issue of, the encounter between West and East, but also Africa, you know. But for many years, it was the only book that was known regarding Sudanese literature. And we had to wait the end of the 90s and the beginning of this centuries to discover new authors like Abdelaziz Barakasakin, Ahmad El-Malik, Stila Gaetano, and now you have so many interesting names on the Sudanese literary scene, but unfortunately, few of them are translated. You know, I sometimes I try to convince publishers to add some new names on the list of Sudanese translated authors, but it's not that easy. You know, the publisher will tell you, well, we already have Abdelaziz and Ahmad al-Malik. It's enough for Sudan, you know, and they don't even try to read the books that you're trying to propose, because they say, well, the market is good like this. You know, it's sometimes publishers, they think in terms of geographical areas and not in terms of quality alone.
What about you?
Something?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I strongly support what Xavier was saying about Tayyib Saleh and the main topic of migration to the north. I mean, it's even the title of the book, Season of Migration to the North. So this was in some way also a classical Arabic topic in novels. The encounter between the Arab and the Western world, Arab and Arabic culture and Europe, which is being dealt with in Season of Migration to the North. And this was the case with very many Arabic authors from the 50s, 60s on up to these days. But when we speak about Africa, there's also another not so well-known case. Of course, I was writing my PhD thesis on Yemeni literature. So this
Which
is
one?
why
Which literature?
Yemen.
Okay,
literature.
Yemen.
You see?
Okay.
And this is why I can talk about this. You had Muhammad Abdul Wali, who was writing in the 60s and the 70s mainly, from the end of the 50s up to 71 when he died. He was half Yemeni and half Ethiopian. His mother was Ethiopian, but he was raised in Addis Ababa or somewhere in Ethiopia, maybe in several regions of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and then came back to Yemen. But he was always writing in Arabic, only in Arabic, and he was considering himself an Arab author and a Yemeni author, not an Ethiopian author, but still. Very many of his short stories and novels were placed in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. Be it Yemeni migrants going there for work, which was the case quite often in the last century. Yemenis migrating to Ethiopia and Eritrea for work and then coming back to Yemen. Or even all the protagonists Ethiopian among themselves. And this was very interesting to see that he was writing about this relationship between the Arab world and the African world. And he wasn't even speaking about Europe. Not once you would read anything about America. Friends there. Yeah, please go ahead.
For people who are listening to us in Africa, one of his books has been translated into English, Dead Eye Stranger. So there is a copy in English which is available, and it's a wonderful novel about his. I mean, his experience as a half Yemeni, half Ethiopian. It's a wonderful book, and I like his short stories too. Yeah,
sounds so cool. Yeah. So you were saying, Günther? Well, you finished your thoughts?
Yes, Muhammad Abdul Wali, this author of They Die as Strangers, was very interesting and very contradicting also, because he was always concentrating on himself being Yemeni, being Arabic, but then he would sometimes give you a picture that life in Ethiopia is much nicer than here. And but still, then you have the Yemeni going there, working there, saving money in order to come back one day, and then in the end he stays there and dies there. And he's somehow he's lost everything. He's lost his home. He's lost his. He doesn't know where he belongs to. So it's also novels taking place between two different cultures, and there's the in a certain way there's a clash of cultures, because Ethiopian culture is very different to Yemeni, and Yemen was always much more conservative and strict than Ethiopia. And the author was caught between these two cultures, and he himself then but he spent quite a time in Europe and in Russia. Very interesting. But always writing about Yemeni issues.
He seemed like such an interesting character.
Can I add something about Yemen?
Please. I want to learn.
Can
I don't know
add
much,
something
so
about Yemeni literature in Africa?
Mm-hmm.
There is a very interesting author. He's a poet, but also a novelist. His name is Ali El-Mugri. And he wrote a very interesting novel about an African community that lives in Yemen. You know, there is a community, they are, well, African people. Mm-hmm. They are called Aghdam, and they live in the margin of the society. They are supposed to be the Aghdam, which actually literally means slaves, you know, servants or slaves. And they live in the slums, in the suburbs of the main cities of Yemen for centuries now. Mm-hmm. And they are really marginalized people. And Ali El-Mugri, he wrote a wonderful novel where the main characters of the novel belong to this community. It's I don't know, Günther, if you know this novel.
Yes, it's called
in Arabic. It's called Ta'am Aswad Ra'iha Sauda.
Yeah, black taste, black smell. Black taste, black smell.
Yeah,
yes.
Black, exactly.
It's a novel taking place
it's
in
a
Yemen.
Very interesting novel.
But it's all about the African.
Yes, it takes place.
Inhabitants of Yemen, the Aghdam.
So it's Africans in Yemen.
So exactly. I'm very happy to with Xavier, because he knows so much about Yemeni literature. Of course, Ali El-Mugri, yes, he's now living in France. Mm-hmm. Yemen is also a country where everything has gone wrong politically, and there's a war going on now for many years. So he's ended up in France, but he's a close friend of mine. Yes, I've got to know him when I was collecting my material on Muhammad Abdul Wali and the Yemeni short stories and novels of the 70s. Yeah, there's so much to tell.
Mm-hmm. Nice. I have to tell you, like, first of all, the thing that's really taken me aback is because I've been watching a lot of the especially in the Middle East, there's been a lot of investment in the publishing and book space. We have, for instance, the Sharjah people have been investing a lot in this space. Just recently Sharjah had the book capital as part of the. So the issue with writers not being able to survive on their craft, which is normal in every country, by the way. Very few writers are able to live on their craft in any society.
Even in Europe.
Even in the US, wherever it is. But the one which is really disturbing me is because I have been seeing like a lot of investment in this space, and I would have assumed that one of the biggest beneficiaries would be writing in Arabic, and it seems that the beneficiary is still the European language. Did you want to speak to this?
Well, as I said,
Günther said something very interesting about.
Go ahead.
No, maybe you can.
Günther said something very. Okay, sorry. Günther said something very interesting about PDF versions. Earlier, I even know some authors who put PDF versions of their books on internet because of the bad relationships they have with the publishers. The publishers don't even pay them, or sometimes an author has to pay a publisher in order to be published. So that's also a part of the problem, you know. There is no good relationship between publishers and writers. I mean, it's not organized like, you know, in Europe. If you're an author and you find a publisher, you will be paid. You will sign a contract. You have rights. You know. I agree with you. It's not that easy to be an author in Europe or in the United States. But well, it's nothing compared to what happens in the Middle East. And so, yes, people, they invest money in book fairs and everything. But I think that it's the book market that should be somehow more, how to say, they should bring some real rules, you know, in the relationship between publishers and many writers, as Günther said again. I mean, they sometimes they rely on the translations into European languages in order to get money, and so they are not even, as he said, interested in well. They dream of being, I mean, translated not only for because they would like to be famous, but also just to get some money, which is a real problem.
As an Arabic author, you have to pay money to the publisher in order to be published, and the publisher would publish anything for money. He wouldn't even ask about quality. There's you haven't got lectorat, how do you call it in English? The books are not well lectured before being published.
Editors.
There's no editing process, or not a real editing process in the publishing houses. Everything is being published just for the money, and the publisher wouldn't. He would not go for making. I mean, to have the book public, wouldn't make public relations for the book. You know, it lacks everything. So you don't even know if even if there's a book, it's published and it's published in Arabic, it's there at the book market, but you cannot be sure about the quality because there's not a good literary criticism. There's not the process of an author to evolve from a young author and then becoming better by the time and being well read, and this is why. And then in the end, nobody knows you in your own country. You know you cannot live by your books, and then you think about going to Europe to be translated into some language, and there, or several languages, maybe get some award, and then there's a path to success. But if you stay just in your country, it is very hard.
I'm really shocked. So the whole publishing process. So there's no proper editing process, and then even when the book comes out, there's no process of distribution and marketing. Generally, I'm sure there may be one or two books who go through that a good process, but generally that doesn't exist for most writers.
Absolutely, yeah. Of course, there are exemptions, and there are very good novels, but you never know.
I have to tell you, I'm really surprised. I never expected, because the impression I've always gotten was that, you know, this system. I mean, they're publishing so many books. I mean, I know about the Algiers Book Fair, which has thousands of books on sale. I always assumed that, you know, this thing. So I'm guessing in fairs like that, some of the really big sellers are maybe the French titles, not the Arabic titles?
Maybe. And just look at the number of the printed copies.
And you know,
the print is about 1,000 normally, not more. Sometimes 500, sometimes 2,000. But it's not like 10,000, 30,000, 100,000, which would be a best-selling book in the West or any Western country. But it's different there. You are a successful author if you have sold 500 books or 1,000 books. That is a good. It's supposed or looked upon to be a good number, but I mean, can you make money out of this? It's very hard.
No, you can't. Xavier, you want to add to that? You look like you wanted to.
Yeah, Günther was also mentioning distribution. You know, it's very interesting. Again, if we go back to Sudanese literature, I remember. I mean, I mention it sometimes in lectures. You know, there is a critic from Egypt. He's an author and a critic. His name is Hajjaj Adul. He wrote a book about Nubian literature, which is literature written by Nubians from southern Egypt and northern Sudan. And so he was focusing on this Nubian literature, and he was talking about Ahmad al-Malik, so a Sudanese writer who is from Nubia, actually.
Okay.
And he said, I have heard that there was a Nubian author who's from Sudan, which is a neighboring country. But I was never able to find a copy of his books. So you see, you have Egypt and you have Sudan just below Egypt. And sometimes, even for an Egyptian, finding a book written in a neighboring country like Sudan is something of, I mean, something impossible, which is quite problematic. It's like if a Belgian reader could not find a book which is published in France, you know, is the same. So there is a real problem in the whole process of how to sell books, and if you add to this, you know, problems like censorship and literacy rate, it also explains why, and poverty. It explains why I mean, a selling book is, I mean, why the figures are low when we are talking about how many copies are sold, plus PDF, plus all those problems.
So, guys, I mean, the thing is,
so that's the state of the market, I would say.
Yeah. So what's been happening in, like, especially the people who are writing in English and French, they tend to have a bit of a very, very optimistic outlook to the medium and long term. Maybe they have those issues. Are you seeing the same thing with the people who write in Arabic across the continent? Is it like is the future bright, or does it look like it's likely to stay this for the next near future?
You mean inside Europe?
No, not in Europe, because I'm assuming like it has to start somewhere, whether it's in Europe. But so if somebody who's writing in Arabic, maybe they're watching and they write in Arabic, is there likely to be a change, or is it going to be the same for the next foreseeable future?
Well, you have to say that the non-European literature is always in a difficult situation in the Western book markets. Do we read a lot of Arabic books translated into German? We don't. Do we read many books of African authors written in several languages, even in English, translated into German? Not really very much. Is the case different with Indian authors, with Chinese authors, or even Korean or Japanese authors? Not really. And I think there are several reasons for that. Maybe it's even in principle. It's a very natural thing that a Belgian citizen would read Belgian literature, a French citizen would read French literature, and the British would read British literature, and the Germans read in German, and Russians read Russian. I mean, there should be the normal thing, like Arabs read Arabic books, and there's nothing bad about this. And in the case of Europe or German, we have so many European novels and books and short stories and whatever coming out every year in the thousands. And of course, not all of this is excellent, but there are very, very many very good books. So if you want the reader to read in addition to all that, translated books, that takes some work to convince them. It must be very good quality literature that you offer to them. Unless without that, you will sell like 500,000, 2,000 copy of that translated book, and that's it. And then you have some specialized readers who would always read everything they can from India, maybe from Japan, from China, because they are interested in this kind of literature or Arabic literature. But it's not for the mainstream. So it will always remain difficult for translated literature from non-European languages, especially. But I mean, before we come to an end, there's also quite good odds for African literature these days. Just remember, less than a month ago, a writer from Tanzania has got the Nobel Prize for Literature, nothing less. Abdelazek. This was, I think, a very encouraging sign for African literature. We have people like Baraka Sakin who have got some awards, literary awards from European countries. Less than a week ago, you had the women writer Tsitsi Dangarembga from Zimbabwe, who won the Peace Prize of the German book trade. And I mean, it seems that the interest for African literature in general is becoming more, and that's a good sign. And I think it's also important that we read more African literature. I read Ken Saro Viva many years ago, Sosa Boy. It was one of the most important books I read. One of the books I won't forget in my life. And it's about, it gives you another picture, a different picture of Africa. It's anti-war literature. It gives you a picture of a loving Africa, far from the crisis and bad news we have become used to in the news every day. And Baraka Sakin is writing in this tradition.
Yeah, I would add that also through Sudanese literature or Eritrean literature, something new is what's happening now in the Arab world. You know, before Sudanese literature was unknown outside of Sudan, even in the Arab world, with the exception of Tayyip Saleh. But if you take somebody like Abdelaziz, he's read in many Arab countries. Günther mentioned Haji Jaber, because he lives in Saudi Arabia. He has a readership. I mean, you find articles in the Arabic press in the Gulf. Yes. About Haji Jaber's book. Yes. If you take Abu Bakr Hamid Kahal, he's another author from Eritrea. He used to live in Libya. he's also quite well known in the Arab world, and but also in the neighboring countries. You know, I was surprised to see that two, I think, of Abdelaziz's books were translated into Kurdish. Kurdish language,
you say Kurdish?
Kurdish. So Kurdish, and I think it was published in northern Iraq, so in Kurdistan. That's quite interesting. I mean, to see this. If you take Kahal's book, so he's from Eritrea. He writes in Arabic, and one of his books has been translated into Turkish. So it's nice to see that you also have, I mean, those new a new horizon for African literature in the Middle East. I mean, it's not just Sudanese readers who read Sudanese literature anymore. I mean, there is a wider readership, despite what we said earlier about the market. Still, that's quite something which is interesting, I think.
Yeah. Which is a good way to wrap up, you know, on a positive note, a more positive note. Thank you, Günther and Xavier, for joining us on the live stream today. And I also want to say thank you. Thank you, guys. I also want to say thank you to the Frankfurter Bookmesse and the German Foreign Federal Office who provided financial support for this stream. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, please have a great evening and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.